We are recording.
Okay.
We are live.
Well, good morning, everyone. Mike Radzicki here. Thank you for inviting me to give a presentation here at our CLM at WPI. I was asked to talk about things here at sort of the beginning of the school year. It's not quite the very beginning. Some tips and things for our graduate students to either expose people for the first time to some of these ideas or to reiterate them for folks who've been here for a while. So I thought I would do that. And I was motivated a little bit by Khaled Saeed's presentation a couple of weeks ago, where he kind of talked about his personal journey, his Ph.D. So I thought I'd make my tips as part of telling you my story about how I went through graduate school. So we have to now, I need to advance my slides here somehow.
Just do page down or return or whatever.
Yeah, I've been doing that. We can go on this one.
Yeah. You were.
The gray dark ones in the left bottom.
Somehow he's controlling this.
There, it escaped from it.
Yeah. There you go.
Okay.
We're there.
All right. A little bit of an IT glitch there, but I guess we're rolling here. I apologize if some of you have heard some of these insights and stories before, but I thought I'd give sort of a comprehensive description. So a little bit about me. So back in the 1970s, when I was in high school, my father would sit at the dinner table with the paper, the Wall Street Journal, and he one day decided to insist that I read the front page and the editorial page and tell him one thing about it. And I was angry at first. I didn't want to do that, but then after a while, I began to enjoy it. And I got interested in economics, okay? And so at that time, the Vietnam War was over. I was too young to participate in that. The only thing that was going on in the mid to later 70s was the economy. And it was bad. And we had stagflation for the first time and what have you. So I decided I was going to be an economist at the Fed and someday be chairman of the Federal Reserve System at 17 years old. On the other hand, my mom wanted me to be a naval officer. So she insisted I apply to Annapolis, the United States Naval Academy. I did. I received a congressional appointment to go there. But when I started going for my physical and all that stuff, they asked me, well, what did I want to do in the service? And I said, I wanted to fly Tomcats off a carrier. And they flipped through the chart and they said, looking at your eyesight, son, you're not flying anything off anything. I was kind of disappointed. My dad said, son, what you're not picking up on is in the service they tell you what to do. And also I think at that time they didn't have an economics major at the academy. They had a minor. I think they have a major now. But anyway, so I decided in the end not to go to the academy. I withdrew or gave back my appointment. And I was late in the game then, so I had to, go to college somewhere. So I applied to a somewhat local liberal arts college, St Norbert College. Tends to be, by the way, is the home of the Green Bay Packers. So there's a bit of a trivia question answer there, I guess, or something. And by luck, dumb luck on my part, because I was late in the game. I just I got to get in somewhere to school. St. Norbert had a very, very outstanding economics department, small but outstanding. I can tell you this because when I went to graduate school, I was better trained than a lot of kids who went to Ivy League schools. So I didn't realize it until I got out of the place and so forth and compared myself. But I was very well trained, and I can thank these three people: Thampy Mammon, George Chooch McCallum. He was a transportation economist who loved trains, so everybody called him Chooch, and Sandia National. To give you an example, Thampy wrote his dissertation under Lawrence Klein, the Nobel laureate, who was one of the founders of econometrics, and Thampy built the first econometric model of the Indian economy. Chooch wrote under Joe Bain, the father of industrial organization at Berkeley, and Sandy wrote under Tom Papke, the guy who ran the National Tax Journal. So these folks had their act together pretty much, and they really gave me quite a good education. I owe a lot to them. When I was a senior, Thampy, who's off on the right-hand side of that picture there, that's me in the center, his dissertation director, Lawrence Klein, was going to give a talk at UW Parkside. And he wanted to go hear him because he was his dissertation director, and said, I want to come along. And I said, yeah. So down we go, and we hear Lawrence Klein and some other luminaries, Carl Brunner, a monetarist, and a guy named Baldwin, an international economist, give their talks. And on the way back to St. Norbert, I said to Thampy, well, if UW Parkside can do this, why can't we have speakers like this come to St. Norbert? And Thampy said, I'm not inviting Klein to St. Norbert unless I know the audience is the room is going to be packed. I can't, And he said, I'll tell you what, if you can prove to me that people will come to hear Klein, I'll invite him. So I went down to the Chamber of Commerce in Green Bay, and I got their mailing list, and I sent out a survey to all the firms in Brown County, and it came back overwhelmingly they would come to hear Lawrence Klein. So Thampy contacted Klein. Klein also suggested Robert Eisner, who I'm right next to there, who was president of the American Economic Association and professor at Northwestern, to come and speak. And it was the first St. Norbert Economic Summit, and I was, because it was my initiative, I was the MC there. By the way, my parents said you need a suit for this, and I saw that Arthur Burns, the chairman of the Fed, I remember I wanted to be wore gray three-piece suit, so I wanted to look like Arthur Burns, and so that's why I'm dressed like that. So Eisner was a very personable guy, very nice guy. Klein, all he did was he's paging through piles of econometric output, in the green, huge mainframe era, oblivious to everybody and one-word answers and stuff. But Eisner's really animated, very nice. And he said to me, he goes, I want to see your application at Northwestern. I want you to come for a Ph.D. there. I want to work with you. Something like, oh my God. So I graduated from St. Norbert, and I applied to 4 schools for my Ph.D. University of Wisconsin, I'm in Wisconsin, that's my home university. University of Minnesota, right next door. So I'm applying to schools, somewhat near, within 4 or 5 hours of my house. And they had a big program with the Minneapolis Fed. Northwestern, because of Bob Eisner saying, I want to see your application. And then I did some research, and I found a really, to my eye, interesting program at Notre Dame. So I said, I'm going to explore these programs and make my decision. So I applied, I got into all the programs. Madison, I just kind of dismissed because half my high school class went there. I was there a million times. It didn't excite me either way. Stupid reason for rejecting it, but I kind of said, this is kind of my safety school. Minnesota, when I went there, I was unimpressed. Everybody was kind of boring, not glad to see me, not there. The hallways were empty, and so, I really didn't come away very impressed with Minnesota. Again, not a great, sample size of 1 day, not a great, I'm young and dumb, but anyway. So it boiled down to Notre Dame or Northwestern. Where am I going to go? Northwestern had Bob Eisner. He wants to see my application. And it was Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Northwestern were all in the top 10 in economics programs ranked. And Notre Dame was considerably lower ranked, but I liked their program a lot better. So it was boiling down to Notre Dame or Northwestern. So I go down to Notre Dame for a tour of the place, and unlike Minnesota where the hallways were empty and no one could care less that I was there, 3 faculty members greeted me. They took me on a tour. They took me out to lunch and dinner. They explained the program, blah, blah, blah. So I was like, holy, yes, they're treating me really, they really want me to come here. And I said, explain the program to me. The first year of the program was traditional orthodox economics. And then the second year was heterodox economics as a contrast. And then you could pick, do you want to play in the orthodox camp or the heterodox camp for your dissertation? And I was like, I don't know what that means, but that sounds interesting, because they said things like you'll read Schumpeter, you'll read Veblen, you'll read Keynes, you'll read Marx and all that. And in Minnesota, they said, you're going to take a lot of differential equation classes. So I was like, it was more interesting, right? along when I'm taking the tour, I'm taken to the campus center, which is not surprisingly given the football reputation of schools, called the Huddle. And they had a room devoted to some dude named Tom Dooley. They had medals struck in the guy's honor, all his honorary doctorates and awards and such. They had a statue to the guy outside. And I've never heard of some guy named Tom. It's like a song or something, you know. It's like there's an Irish song. Tom Dooley, like, exactly. So I'm like, I don't know who they, but they obviously this guy did something good. He's got all this, you know, stuff. They got a room devoted to the guy's statues and stuff. So I go, who is this guy? Well, he's known as the Jungle Doctor. He was an alum. He went into the Navy and went to medical school. Then went into the Navy. He was a Navy doctor. I think the Navy might have paid for his education. And this is in the 50s, when the French were in Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and all that. And he saw the plight of the people there. And then when he got out of the Navy, he opened hospitals and clinics in Laos, in the jungles, and attended to the people there as a physician. The word is that he was quite a shy guy and didn't like public speaking, but he would come back and force himself to accept awards and make speeches to raise money for his clinic. So already you can see there's going to be a movie or something about this guy. To add drama to it, he contracts cancer. And he goes and he continues to attend patients in the jungle while suffering from, I think it was spinal cancer, like horrifically bad cancer. And then, of course, in the end, he passes away. So I'm like, I can see why this guy has a statue and so forth. I had never heard of this guy before in my life, but oh my God, you know, holy cats. So again, I'm trying to figure out, am I going to go to Notre Dame or am I going to go to Northwestern? Northwestern has Bob Iser, it's more highly ranked. Notre Dame has a more interesting program. And there is a deadline, at least when I went through, a national deadline for when you had to decide when you're going to accept a fellowship here or a fellowship there, because if you don't want theirs, they give it to somebody else's. And it was a week away, and my mom said, you better decide which of these places you're going to go to. It was a very warm, it was spring break, it was a very warm winter, and my mom said, why don't you go to the store and get some bread and milk, you know, a few items. And I said, okay, I'll do that for you. And it was a very warm winter day, so I said, I'll walk, I won't take the car. So I went walking, and I got a bag full of groceries, and I'm walking back home. I'm holding a bag in front of me, so I cannot see down. I crossed the street, 7th Street, Sheboygan, Wisconsin, in the middle of the street, and when I get to the other curb, I'm about to step up on the other side of the street, and I trip. I thought I had, in my mind's eye, I had tripped on a rock about this big, about the size of a softball. I didn't go down, but I tripped significantly, and I can't see because I'm carrying the groceries. And I'm like, what the heck? And I look down, and in the gutter of this street in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, where I randomly crossed, is a book about Tom Dooley, who a week and a half ago I had never heard of in my life. And I said, I'm going to Notre Dame. So I called him immediately as soon as I got home. I said, I'm going to Notre Dame. So that's how I ended up going to Notre Dame. So there's a version. I have the book at home. It's more battered, but that's the book. There's actually a book by his mom about herself. So tip number 1, ranking aside, for your PhD, it is vital that you enroll at a university and program that resonates with you. I'm really glad I went to Notre Dame. It was ranked lower than Northwestern or Minnesota or Wisconsin. But I would have never heard about system dynamics, for example, when I went there, and I would have never heard about some of the heterodox stuff. To me, as an undergraduate, economics was economics. There wasn't like different schools of thought. I never knew about any of this. So I think it's hard to do a PhD, but it's even harder if you don't like the place you are studying at. So in my second year, when we started this heterodox stuff, right, I took a class from somebody named Chuck Wilbur, and I knew he was in the department, but I didn't know him, right? So we're sitting there on the first day of class. It's a doctoral seminar, and everybody's sort of buzzing and chit-chatting, and he walks into the room and walks to the front, and there was a table with a little lectern on it. He was carrying a big pile of books and papers and stuff, and he saw we were all buzzing and chit-chatting and kind of ignoring him. So he just went boom, and he dropped everything, and it went slam on the table, all his books. And everybody stopped and looked up, and he grabbed the lectern, and he leaned out over the lectern, and the first words out of his mouth were, "How do you know if an explanation for something is true? First words out of his mouth. And of course, my first reaction is, well, tell me your name and give me the syllabus before you start in on me, right? But then I thought, you know, that's a pretty damn fine question. How do you know if an explanation for something is true? Well, the whole course was on economic methodology. It delved into philosophy of science. How do scientists explain things? How do philosophers explain things? How do economists explain things? And of course, the idea being there's more than one way to do economics, right? So I'm like, never heard any of this stuff before, so I'm taking notes furiously. I'm like all ears, like, tell me more, this is really interesting. So a lot of the course boiled down to Descartes versus Hume. Really, it goes back to Plato. Basically, it's deductive reasoning versus inductive reasoning, or rationalism versus empiricism. And I just pulled this from the internet. Basically, with deductive reasoning, what you do is you start with the mind, because your senses can be misleading. Think of an optical illusion. So you start with the mind, you start with theory, you start with logic. And in modern times, the logic of our theories is created with math. From the logic, you derive testable hypotheses. And then you look at the real world to see if the data bear out or support your theory. So Einstein comes up with the theory of relativity, puts it in a journal. Empirical physicists read about it, and they design experiments when during a solar eclipse they can see if light is being bent and all this stuff and so forth. That's Descartes' point of view. Whereas Hume said, no, 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 you have to use inductive reasoning or empiricism, that everything comes from looking at the real world first, and then if you find patterns, you start to generalize. You start to accumulate patterns, and then eventually you develop theories. So deductive reasoning goes from theory to the real world. Inductive reasoning goes from the real world up to theory. So it's either sort of top down or bottom up. And it's an old debate in philosophy of science and so forth as to which is the proper way to do science. So in traditional economics, Chuck Wilber taught us, well, they use this deductive covering law model. So you have your theory and you devise testable hypotheses. This is what the orthodox economists do. We needn't delve into all the philosophical details here, but I thought I'd give you an example how traditional economics is done. So Keynes is the guy who invented macroeconomics in the 1930s. He was trying to explain why there was a Great Depression, what to do about it, to get out of it. So he wrote a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, or simply The General Theory. Okay, and in The General Theory, he postulates a fundamental psychological law. And he says, blah, 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 blah. We need, in the interest of time, I won't read it to you, but basically, if you take his words, what he said was this. As income increases in the household sector, spending by the household sector increases as well. So when the household sector has more income, it spends more. And number two, as the household sector gets more income, it spends less as a fraction of its income, or it saves more as a fraction of its income. All this gibberish here means that, okay? Well, it turns out you can turn that into math very easily. It's a line. Keynes was describing a line. You have a Cartesian plane with y and x on it, that's misleading, y and x traditionally, but c and y, okay? Income of the household sector and spending by the household sector, which is C, or consumption. And the first part of Keynes's theory, his fundamental psychological laws, when y goes up, c goes up, the slope of the line has to be positive. The second statement, that the fraction of spending falls, or the fraction saved goes up as y goes up, you can find that out if you run a ray, the dotted line from the origin to any point on the consumption function. Okay, and the slope of that ray is the fraction of income spent. And if you move to a point on the y-axis farther to the right, that ray gets flatter. Okay, the fraction gets smaller. Okay, so the consumption function has to have a positive slope and a positive vertical axis intercept. It can't come out of the origin or strike the vertical axis negative to meet Keynes's theory of how the household sector spends and saves. Okay?
Are you okay with questions, or Or do you want to keep going?
Yeah, because the interest of time.
Okay,
Yeah.
keep
So,
going. Last one.
okay. So we've taken his gobbledygook here. We've said what he's saying is this, and we can make it into math. It's logically consistent. Now we go find data on C and Y, and this is from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And you can see the linear regression. It fits the data very nicely. But looky here, look at that y-intercept there, or the vertical axis intercept, excuse me, it's minus 55.4. It's striking below the origin there. It's not striking the C axis there in positive terms. So that suggests that Keynes was wrong. But if you use cross-sectional data, you find out that it supports Keynes' theory. So this was a controversy in economics. The point is, though, you see, you start from theory, you derive testable hypotheses, then you look at the real world, you get data and whatever, and you see if it supports the theory or not. That's how orthodox economists do their thing. On the other hand, the heterodox people, this was the stuff that was news to me, they do something called pattern modeling. They follow Hugh. They look at the real world first. So the economist is a detective at a crime scene trying to piece together an explanation for what happened. And he or she is going to use the holistic or systems approach. This is not me interpreting. This is what they said, the heterodox economists were saying. They're trying to take pieces of a puzzle or of stained glass and put it together into a coherent whole, a mosaic or a puzzle, this sort of thing. So pieces linked together. They're taking a systems approach. They look for chains of cause and effect. They also use a dynamic, really an evolutionary approach. They're essentially doing the Harvard Business School's case study. I mean, they even say we do case studies. Now, one of the problems with doing case studies is really there's not a lot of math. Okay, so the case study approach is being, those who do that are accused of being non-rigorous. Right? Also, the heterodox economist said if you find commonalities among different pattern models, things that are similar, you group those together into what are called real typologies. And if you find commonalities among different real typologies, those are principles of economics. You're going from the real world up to theory. You're building theory, finding these commonalities. And they argued that the most important commonality was Gunnar Myrdal, Nobel laureate's idea of circular and cumulative causation. That's the most important idea or theory in economics, according to these heterodox economists. And more recently, they've been saying stock flow consistent models. Okay? And then these theories and these real typologies help the economist detective at the next crime scene figure out what's going on. So here's some examples of stock flow consistent modeling in heterodox economics and Myrdal's circular and cumulative causation. Okay, so it looks kind of like this. Okay, so you start with the pattern models, you develop real types, principles of, I should have said economics, I said systems there, that's a mistake. I should have said principles of economics, and those are used to help the detective at the next pattern model. By the way, what the difference between inferential statistics and econometrics and data mining is similar. Data mining is you start with the data, you don't have a theory per se, you find patterns in the data and then you build up from there. It's the same idea. Now, at Notre Dame, there's actually system dynamics going on in the 1970s and 1980s when this is taking place in the early 1980s, 80, 81, I'm describing. So there are two guys, Bill Davidson and John Urand. Bill Davidson was an economist, John Urand was an electrical engineer, and they were interested in the world modeling projects of the early 70s. So they wanted to run the World 3 model, but at that time it was only, you could only run it in Dynamo. And to run Dynamo, you needed 10 grand and an IBM 360 because it was written, that Dynamo, I believe, was written in IBM 360 assembly language. So they were frustrated that they couldn't do that, so they got a grant and they developed ND-Tran for Notre Dame Translator, and it was alternative to Dynamo. It was very Dynamo-like, but it was Fortran-based. So you could run it if you had a Fortran compiler. You didn't need an IBM 360. And they put it on a consortium for $50. So Bill and John were not really modelers, but they made sure the library had a big collection of system dynamics books and stuff like that. So one day, I'm taking this class and I'm looking for something in the library, and I come across one of the system dynamics books by Forrester, and I start reading it by what's this? I was broadly aware that Bill Davidson in the econ department was doing some simulation thing. And I'm reading a paper by Forrester, and he's describing system dynamics models as computerized case studies. That there are these commonalities, if you will, called generic structures, and then above there you have his fundamental principles of systems. Jay even wrote a book called Principles of Systems. And of course, one of the big principles of system dynamics is that you use stocks and flows and feedback loops, circular and cumulative causation to do system dynamics modeling. It's fundamental, right? And I'm thinking, didn't I just hear all this in this Chuck Wilber's class? And so I go running into Chuck Wilber. Oh, professor, look what I found. I think it's the same, and you should start using system dynamics in heterodox economics. His reaction was to get angry at me because he was a heterodox guy, and his stuff was sort of anti-math. He was doing Harvard case, and he was, math is bad in economics because you can't capture the richness of a case study. To his credit, he said, you got to write me a paper for the class, write it up. So I did, and it ended up, he gave me an A, and he said, I got to learn system dynamics. I think you're right. So I had this eureka moment that, what I just said, and I called the blending of heterodox economics and the system dynamics, I called it institutional dynamics. And I wrote some papers on that. So tip number 2 for the students, generally speaking, you should write for audience who will value your work. Heterodox economics journals, where I was writing, and also in System Dynamics Review, are usually ranked lower than orthodox journals because the heterodox economists are the critics, right? But the readers of those journals valued what I was saying, and I think that's important. You want to write for those who will read your work, not blow it off or not attach value to it. So you got to find your people as academics. Jay used to always tell me, because he was interested in what I was doing, don't write for academic economists because they're incentivized to publish papers in refereed journals, not to make the economy better, which is true. He said you should be writing for corporate managers because they'll care about what you're doing and they want to see the economy. So I thought, okay, I'll do an application of this set of ideas for my dissertation. And what I wanted to do was, Dwayne Ward wrote a book where he was comparing and contrasting John Kenneth Galbraith's work on the American economy and some guy named James O'Connor who had sort of a Marxist view on that. And they were similar but different. I thought I should build a John Kenneth Galbraith model, a James O'Connor model, and then compare and contrast the feedback loops and all that stuff, as well as bring in Ward's commentary and critiques. I thought that'd be a very cool, it's an application of institutional dynamics and whatever. So tip number 3, the sooner you decide on your dissertation topic, the sooner you can start directing all your efforts in a specific direction, right? So once I hit on this eureka thing, I was like laser focused on this idea, right? And of course, anytime you got to write a paper for a course, let's say, or do a CLM or something, if you know specifically or kind of sort of what your dissertation topic is going to be, you should be directing your efforts in that direction because, of course, you got to do something anyway. So you might as well kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Now, I had a problem. No one would agree to supervise this dissertation. The economists who thought it was kind of cool, interesting, they said, but I don't know diddly about this thing called system dynamics, and I'm not comfortable supervising you because I can't help you. I don't really understand what the heck you're doing. Back then, this is the early 80s, the idea of applying simulation in economics and doing simulation models was quite new, in economics anyway. Dynamic models, to the extent they were done, were very simple, 1-page difference or differential equation models that were solved analytically, not solved via simulation. So they didn't even know how to interpret results and so forth. Now, Bill Davidson was in the econ department. He didn't work with the grad students. He was an undergraduate-centric guy. He knew about system dynamics, but he hated the topic. He was an orthodox economist. And he was also he was like 6'8", shaved head, huge black glasses, real rough guy. And it was not unusual for our meetings to start with, "God damn it, Radzicki," and then he'd start in on me after that. So I ended up not doing that for my dissertation because I just said to Bill one day, "Bill, I can't do this anymore." So I went to the guy I was working 20 hours a week for, and I said, Bill had said, "You got to do something with Indiana state taxes." So I did something with Indiana state taxes. Much to my disappointment, but you know, you'll see later, one of my tips is the best dissertation is one that's done and it's signed by your committee and in the library. So you do what you got to do to get through the program. So tip number 4, when choosing a PhD dissertation supervisor and committee, it is helpful if they, number 1, support and value your dissertation topic. Life is much easier, but know something about your topic so they can help you, and know and accept their respective roles. So what you don't want is a bunch of, let's call them alpha males or alpha personalities in the room, all of whom want to be the director of the dissertation, and all of whom are drawing lines in the sand, and I'm not signing until this happens. You know, your role as a reader should be to assist, but get out of the way. Let the chair sort of run the show, be the conductor of the orchestra. In other words, people got to play well in the sandbox together and know the roles. Now, Jay Forrester took quite an interest in what I was doing because at the time he was working on a system dynamics national model. He took me out to lunch one day and said, "Order whatever you want." So I ordered a nice meal. And he ordered a nice meal too. He didn't touch his. He pulled out a notebook and pen and during the entire lunch asked me questions about economics, institutional dynamics, whatever, and took notes on everything I was saying. His view from his experience with economists in the Sloan School and Limits to Growth was economists don't like system dynamics. And I got him to change his mind to some economists don't like system dynamics. The orthodox people won't. Why? Because you're not doing science the way they do science. You're following Hume, you're not following Descartes. They follow Descartes. They follow deductive logic. You've got to talk to the right economists. And he invited me several times to talk to the sponsors of his national model. And he read and commented on my papers. And like I said, he encouraged me to write a book for corporate managers. So the system dynamicists kind of accepted my arguments. The heterodox economists did as well. The guy who ran the Journal of Economic Issues, where I published my first article on institutional dynamics, made it the lead article in the journal because he thought it was so important. His name was Glenn Atkinson. And I got invited to speak at conferences and universities and whatever, but not much was really happening to implement what I was saying. So I was being shown courtesy, but nothing was really happening. When some people tried to actually do institutional dynamics, it was almost always PhD students looking for a dissertation topic. They'd send me their work and it was horrible. Why? Because this is in the 80s. They were trying to learn system dynamics on their own. Sturman's book wasn't written yet. There was no internet, no online classes, so they were struggling to learn this stuff on their own. So my conclusion was we need a program where institutional dynamics or economics and system dynamics is taught. Notre Dame would not let me create such a program. They said they would, but they gave me just lip service. Why? Because I was teaching 250 student cattle car statistics courses for them that nobody else wanted to do. And they liked that I was doing it. And they wanted to keep me doing that. So they told me whatever I wanted to hear to keep me doing that. But at some point when I got to be more senior there, I said, look, I want to do this or I'm leaving. They said, well, we're not going to let you. We have no idea what you're talking about. So I started looking for a place to do this. WPI said, we're looking for a macro money economist. You're going to teach engineering students economics. System dynamics comes from engineering. And I was 40 miles from Jay. So I'm like, I'm leaving Notre Dame and I'm coming to WPI. So that's how I came here. One of my first hires in the program was this guy. I'll let this sink in for a moment. We're not in Sheboygan, Wisconsin there, or in Worcester.
Big picture.
All right.
This is one on the left.
Exactly right. All right, so we started the program. Most of you know kind of the history of that. That's why you're all here. He's retired, but he was at the University of Nevada, Reno. But in 2003, WPI hosted the System Dynamics Conference. I asked Glenn Atkinson, the editor who put my articles, the lead article, to give a plenary session talk. And what does he think of all of this now in retrospect? And here's what he said. I suggest that institutional economists and system dynamics modelers could collaborate on modeling the explanation of the evolution of the shoemaking industry from 1648 to 1895 as described by John Commons, blah, blah, blah. Again, we're going to post these slides, so it'll be easy to in the interest of time. A purpose of this modeling exercise would be to show institutional economists that rich historical and cultural context does not have to be sacrificed to gain the benefits of a model. The exercise, if successful, would open up a line of discourse between practitioners of system dynamics and a school of economists interested in many of the same policy questions, blah, blah, blah. Tip number 5. When doing simulation modeling, it is important that domain experts, who are almost always non-modelers or non-simulation modelers, accept your work as legitimate. They don't know the modeling, but they know the domain. So Glenn is saying, until we in institutional economics see something like this, we're still skeptical about what you guys are doing. And so he was saying this to the plenary session. I'm showing you how to work more closely with us and get your work accepted in heterodox economics. Now, there are some issues with system dynamics modeling that I want to call to people's attention. And this is why, in more modern times, some of us around here have been suggesting broadening our thinking to the idea of simulation science. John Sturman has just written an article for the System Dynamics Review, basically saying, what would Jay do going forward? I think John has reached the same conclusion as I'm reaching here. So there are some issues with system dynamics, although there are solutions for them, but nevertheless, we need to talk about them. One is, our system dynamics models evolutionary? Institutional economists also call themselves evolutionary economists, okay? And so they want to know, can system dynamics models learn and adapt and evolve in the sense of Darwin, or Marx, or Schumpeter, or Veblen? And they discuss the distinction between Newtonian change and Darwinian change, or ergodic versus non-ergodic models. In other words, Newtonian change is change within an unchanging structure, like the heavenly bodies. The universe is what it is, and the change, the rotation of the planets around the sun, just happens within that same structure. Whereas Darwinian change is that the structure changes as well as the behavior changes. In other words, in system dynamics, we say structure causes behavior, but for evolutionary behavior, behavior has to feed back and alter the structure of the system, alter the equations of the system, or you can get into shifting feedback loop dominance, the active equations of the system. Jay would say, does that really matter? And it's the modeling process that matters, and certainly during the process of modeling, you're altering the structure as well as the behavior. It's an iterative process. So it's a non-solvable debate, but these people are going to want to see evolving models. The schools of evolutionary economics and the neo-Schumpeterians are going to want to see the models literally evolve. And really, you're talking sort of agent-based modeling if you want non-ergodicity, or at least chaos in the models. Other issues: poor user interfaces, poor spatial capabilities in system dynamics. Of course, the order of entry is not preserved in our stocks. So if you're using FIFO or LIFO accounting, first in, first out, last in, first out, or a manufacturing process where something has to sit, the glue has to dry for 2 hours, it matters when the widget came in. Everything in a stock is assumed to be identical. We have continuous time modeling with system dynamics, but we perform it on a discrete machine. So the flows in the model represent instantaneous change, although that's not an infinitesimally small step size, but the concept is instantaneous change, but people come in with flow data, like sales data, but it's like weekly sales, Monday sales plus Tuesday sales plus Wednesday. So it's not an instantaneous, it's really an integral in there, an accumulation process, making that data. So the data does not conform to the concepts. This bothers some people, including economists. Non-integer entities, 100.12.5 people, and they say there's only 100 or 101 people. How can you have a fractional person? System dynamics has solutions to these issues, but many of them begin to move away from the original paradigm. Now, Sturman's article kind of suggests, so what? The original paradigm was developed by Forrester in the 50s and 60s when technology was different, what have you. But these, practically speaking, are things you have, when you go out to economists and say, use this stuff or accept my stuff, these issues are raised. So tip number 6, when presented with a problem, it is vital that you choose the right tools for the job and follow the best practice for the use of that tool or tools. Right? And given some of these things, you might be able to horse it with system dynamics. You might be able to use conveyors in a Stella model to deal with the order of entry not preserved situation, whatever. And that might be just fine, or it might be, you might have to say, not every problem is a system dynamics problem. It might be some other discrete event problem or something like that. So then lastly, I was asked, and I think Christine shared this to show my list of questions. I have actually revised it ever so slightly since it went out, so we need to post a newer version of this thing.
You can send it to the list.
But it occurred, do I have to?
You have to share it at a new screen.
Okay, so I have to quickly figure out.
There you go.
Okay, and then this
Just
is
minimize that.
minimized. Okay, so I wrote this up just in an effort to provide some food for thought for our students when they're thinking about a dissertation. Because I've noticed over the years here and elsewhere that doctoral students, number one, if you're a doctoral student, you're a good student. If you're a crummy student, you're not going to do a PhD. Number two, you're typically really into it. You want to do a great job, and some people see the dissertation as their magnum opus. It's my doctoral dissertation. It's going to be in the library for 1,000 years. It must be my greatest effort ever. And that's the wrong way to think about it, I think. So the dissertation is your first research effort, not your magnum opus thing that you're going to write about when you're 80 years old. So here are some things to think about, or questions you should answer when you're developing your dissertation proposal. In one sentence in plain English, what is the question the dissertation will answer, the problem it will solve, or the controversy it will resolve? So a good way to think about things is ask a question, answer a question. So one of the obligations of the committee is to make sure you're not asking and answering a trivial question or a question that's like a course project question, but a PhD level question, but that you're not taking such a big bite that you're overdriving your headlights. It's a Goldilocks problem. A big enough question or set of questions to warrant a PhD, but not so big that you're too ambitious. If you're doing a 3-paper dissertation, you want to think about maybe 3 questions to ask and answer, or something like that. If it's 4 instead of 3, so what? But you don't want a rambling problem statement. You want to ask a question or a modest set of questions and answer. Number 2, why is finding an answer to the question, a solution to the problem, or a resolution to the controversy important? This is the so what question. Jay always advised us, if you got to do this work, you've got to work on a problem, work on an important problem. Right? Number 3, how have others answered the question, solved the problem, or resolved the controversy? Guess what? You stand on the shoulders of giants. That's why you can see farther. That's what Newton said. It's on the edge of the British 2-pound coin, right? So you got to figure out who previously has worked on this, what have they done, and what am I going to do that's better, different, unusual, creative, or whatever. So, and again, you can be doing this in your coursework. If you got to write a paper for a course or something, you can do it in your literature. You kind of know what your dissertation topic is going to be. Number 4, how do you plan to answer the question, solve the problem, or resolve the controversy? And why do you anticipate that the results will be different and better? And again, one of the committee's responsibilities is to determine whether or not you're approaching the problem correctly. Your questions there, how are you going to answer these questions? How are you going to do this? Does that sound reasonable or not? And if you do what you say you're going to do, will you likely generate useful and scientifically valid results. And if the committee does not feel that, they're going to say go back and figure out a different way to approach the problem. Now I'm watching my clock here. Number 5, if you're going to use system dynamics or agent-based modeling to answer the question, solve the problem, etc., what simulation experiments do you tend to run in the model, and how will you measure or judge the results of these experiments? And this is our classic question. Which simulation run is best and why? Sometimes it's obvious the bad thing that was previously growing is now shrinking. But usually you get trade-offs. More of A means less of B, more of B means less of A. And A and B are both valued by people, right? And so it's not obvious. So you need to generate some sort of scoring mechanism or multi-criteria decision function. Saeed Langaruti made a utility function in his model and so forth to try and disentangle which run is best and why. What do you recommend? When thinking about this issue, over the years, it's been the case that we found that experts and stakeholders, domain experts, can fill whiteboards or journal articles with proposed solutions to problems that are logical, have support in the academic literature, and can be shown to have worked elsewhere. So simulation can be helpful in disentangling all this stuff that at first pass is entirely reasonable, and you should be looking for which proposed solutions yield the best bang for the buck. We're looking for leverage points, what combinations of proposed solutions are best. Too high leverage policies in isolation may counteract each other when used together. If you're using policy changes together, should they be used simultaneously together or recursively, first one, then the other? And are there any unintended consequences, as latent structures that Khaled teaches about, that are going to crop up and bite you? I'll wrap it up here. What are the deliverables of the dissertation? And why do they represent new knowledge? Are you going to offer policy recommendations? Are you going to deliver a piece of software, a game, something like this? Are the deliverables potentially knowable without all the fuss? This is the duck question. Do you really need a large system dynamics model that took you a year to build to conclude that you should buy low and sell high in stock market? Not disputing that, but I mean, do you really need a model to tell you that? The model, you should be looking for something that you can't find out without the modeling. And can you pull this off in a calendar year? If you're saying this is a 5-year project, that's not a dissertation. If it's a 3-month project, it's not a dissertation. It's, broadly speaking, it's probably a calendar year, 12-month project. And then again, who's your audience? Where are you going to publish this stuff? Who's going to care about what you're doing? And I'm just about a minute under according to this clock. I'll leave you with this. I said it before. Always remember that the best dissertation is one that is finished, signed by your committee, and residing in your university's library, because now you have what we'd say in economics, your union card, you have your credential, and then you can go out and write your magnum opus. And I'll leave it lie there because I'm looking at.
It looks like we have comments.
That's just
here.
bring things. Saying thank you for.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We may
Thank
want to
you
hit
for
the
standing
stop
by.
on the record.
Not
But
yet.
thank you, Mike. That's good.
Yeah, I was going to say, I wanted to surprise you with the